The impetus for writing this book is that very selfish. I was just utterly, completely miserable. I was confronted with the headlines of 2020, as we all were, which were just horrible, especially if you're a pundit whose job is to consume the news tirelessly, internalize it, and analyze it. So the day-to-day headlines were pandemic, lockdown, cities on fire, every institution in America reconceptualizing the founding as something horrid and evil. And it was just soul-crushing.
Welcome to Acton Line, a podcast from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. In The Rise of the New Puritans, Commentary Magazine associate editor Noah Rothman explains how, in pursuit of a better world, a relatively new and fervent strain of progressivism in a, quote, burst of moral enthusiasm, is ruining the very things which make life worth living by attempting to craft a society full of verbal tripwires and digital witch hunts. Football? Too violent. Fusion food? Appropriation. The nuclear family? Oppressive. As the social scientist Yuval Levin wrote in a review of the book, what's interesting about this new Puritanism is that, quote, it is not rooted in a Christian ethic, at least not explicitly, and therefore that its worldly severity is not moderated by humility before the divine. In response to this phenomenon, Rothman encourages us to spurn a movement whose primary goal has become limiting happiness. The book uncovers the historical roots of this war on fun and reminds us of the freedom and personal fulfillment at the heart of the American experiment. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/podcast. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Noah Rothman is the associate editor of Commentary Magazine. He appears daily on the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast and is an MSNBC NBC News contributor. Noah is the author of Unjust, Social Justice, and the Unmaking of America. His latest book is The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun, which we'll be discussing today. Noah Rothman, welcome to Acton Line.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
As a regular listener to the Commentary podcast, I had to resist the temptation to say hi, Noah, as the introduction there. But let's start here. I've been routinely stealing Jonah Goldberg's first question for people who have books of what is your book about. And I want to get to that in general in a moment, but I want to start with, again, going back to the title of it, The Rise of the New Puritans. I imagine a good amount of our audience may be familiar with this, but let's just do it for everybody's sake. Who were the original Puritans?
The original Puritans, Big P Puritans, was a religious sect that emerged in England, became a transatlantic phenomenon rather quickly. They were an uncompromising breed of Protestants who had an exacting view of the kind of behaviors that you were to engage in if you were to communicate piety and to achieve piety and closeness with God. And it was, as scholars have noted, it was a religious view, a theory of theology, but it transcended that. It transcended religious practice. It encompassed political practice as well, but it was more than that even. It was a theory of social organization. It was a way of life. Every facet of society had to comport with this rather exacting view. It had a shorter shelf life in England than it had in the United States, where it lacked its natural predators that hounded it in Europe. And the kind of exacting view of politics and social life that we commonly attribute to Puritanism, Big P Puritanism in the United States, is actually, according to scholars of the phenomenon, more a byproduct of what it evolved into the 19th century, the kind of moral policing and comstockery that developed incubated in mainline Protestant New England and subsequently took over the political culture in the 19th century. That sort of stereotypical blue-nosed, prudish, puritanical, generally elite figure who springs to mind when we think of stereotypes around Puritanism don't really comport with the 16th, 17th century iteration of this phenomenon. The Puritans themselves get a very bad rap. They bequeathed us with this profoundly beneficial legacy of proto-democratic institutions, an uncompromising abolitionism, a sort of idea of a social safety net, proto idea of a social safety net, so that you don't have to rely on charity in your darkest moments. These are what the Puritans bequeathed us. They are not remembered fondly for their efforts, however. They are remembered as laughingstocks. And very much the same phenomenon, I believe, will hound this present iteration of Puritanism, which this book demonstrates has a lot of tethers that link it to not just 19th century progressivism, as progressives, what you would imagine progressives share a lot of similarities with their earlier progenitors of their philosophy, but also with Puritanism. And this book provides some help to help you understand and navigate what is otherwise just an unnavigable labyrinth of crazy, applying a moral framework to it to make more sense, but also to give you some idea of the seeds of destruction that this movement is sowing for itself and how it will unravel.
So I often think the progressives seem unaware of their own intellectual history, and you can go back to the early 20th century and see just how important the social gospel movement was in early progressivism. So you can find these, perhaps if not the same exacting moralist standards of the Puritans as you were describing, but at least that kind of a moralism through early progressivism until it kind of became, I suppose, convenient to forget about that part. You get into, I suppose, the 1960s, where you start having things like the sexual revolution, and the nature of the left and progressivism in America changes, and it kind of shreds that for an anti-moralism.
Yeah. Progressivism in the 19th century was as much a political program and a political movement as it was a movement, of a moral movement, of spiritual rejuvenation. I mean, we kind of forget because popular culture has tried to foist this upon the shoulders of conservatives and conservatism. But prohibition was the Protestant experiment. Temperance was the mainline Protestant moral crusade of its time, and prohibition was its ultimate outgrowth. And the spectacular legal debacle was as much a moral crusade as anything else, perhaps more than a legal reform. And there are many such similar approaches to reforming the social contract in the 19th century, a progressive vision of reform that eventually found its home in the Republican Party, but it took some time to get there. And the Republican Party was more a progressive party in the early part of the 20th century. But progressivism itself has found a home in both political coalitions, as has Puritanism. These are traditions that have found a comforting place in both political coalitions. We're all heirs to this tradition, aspiring social reformers, much more perhaps than others. So this is a part of our shared political heritage and tradition that modern progressives won't recognize in themselves, only because their grandparents and parents rejected it so profoundly. As you mentioned, in the sexual revolution, this sort of intellectual tendency. And there were dissenters at the time, which have since found their audience, who dissented against the licentiousness and hedonism of this view of liberalism that took shape in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and took over the culture in the 1980s, 1990s. So they would not recognize that in themselves, only because they're borrowing a heritage that is not their own anymore, that they reject rather profoundly. And one of the recommendations of this book is to confront the younger generations, very austere generation that is attempting to remoralize society with the fact that they are less accepting, less licentious, less chill than their parents and grandparents. They would reject that rather profoundly, I think. But it is nevertheless the fact. There's plenty of evidence for it in this book. And it goes some way, I think, to identifying the silliness, the silly excesses of this particular movement, and most importantly, giving the audience for this book a permission structure to laugh at that which is objectively hilarious. A lot of what we see from the activist wing of the puritanically inclined progressive is rather menacing because they intend to make themselves menacing. But if you were to examine this with a historical lens and a little bit of perspective, it helps the audience understand what they're watching is actually a very American feature of the human experience, and one that is short-lived, as all cults of misery tend to be.
Let's back up here, I think, to a version of that first question I said I usually ask. Rather than what is your book about, what drew you to write this book and to make this connection between Puritanism, the original Puritans, as I had you describe, and the modern movement that you're taking on in this book?
The impetus for writing this book is that very selfish. I was just utterly, completely miserable in late fall, December of 2020 when I began shopping this pitch around. I was confronted with the headlines of 2020, as we all were, which were just horrible, especially if you're a pundit whose job is to consume the news tirelessly, internalize it, and analyze it. So the day-to-day headlines were pandemic, lockdown, cities on fire, every institution in America reconceptualizing the founding as something horrid and evil. And it was just soul-crushing. So I'm sitting with my wife talking about, what can I do to escape this miserable trap? And she said, what do you want to do? Well, if I had my druthers, I would talk to people and businesses and industries I like and just sort of get away from the daily headlines. Sports broadcasters, showrunners, comics, chefs, everybody who's in entertainment fields that I like and enjoy. But no, you can't, because there's no escape from politics anymore. It's infected every institution, every field of the human experience, perhaps even especially those that aren't political, have committed themselves to politics. There's no getting away from this. And she said, that's the book. And it did become the book. But it took a while to develop the theory around Puritanism. It began with just the subtitle, which is Progressives' War on Fun. And it took a bit to identify a sort of through line between, which is not, I'm not the first to do it, obviously, but a through line between modern progressive thought and how progressives and Puritans, their forebearers with their ideological proclivities, policed public morality. And then once you saw the similarities in the effort to police public morality and apply a totalitarian framework, by definition, because its prescriptions are total, a totalitarian framework on every feature of society, that sort of answered the question for itself, that this was a puritanical mission. It's not the fact that it's not a new observation made it a little more difficult, not commercially perhaps, but in an effort to be as intellectually comprehensive and generous as possible. Because I'm not the first person to have this observation, I wanted to make sure that it was the most comprehensive argument that could be made, citing primary documents from the period and what have you. So the research process became a little bit more involved after we established the through line to Puritanism. But initially, it was this series of anecdotes about progressives making your life miserable, which is fun to read and enjoy and simmer in, but it doesn't really give you a taxonomy of what this ideology is that you're confronting and how to combat it. So it was more prescriptive, I guess, than just observational.
I remember having a rather similar experience of observing all of these things where you see how politics has seeped into all of them. And I'm a fan generally of Yuval Levin's theory that as Congress has abdicated its responsibilities to do politics, that's part of the reason why it has seeped into every other part of the culture. But one of the things that always sticks out to me is you are not granted a freedom anymore to either not have an opinion or to not care about something. Everybody has to be a part of it. It turns into everyone being that guy from Blazing Saddles who points out, I didn't get a harumph from you. Everybody had to post the black square on Instagram. Or even I just discovered this, that there is a friend of mine from back home is a fan of the band Hanson and made reference to something called Hansongate, which I had no idea what she was talking about, and being curious to a fault, decided to Google it. And basically it was the band's refusal to say the words Black Lives Matter. And it is just that I didn't get a harumph from you. So there's no space granted for people to just say, I don't particularly care about this, or I'm not going to be involved. There is this expectation that everybody has to be involved in these same political causes to the same extent as the best advocates for it are.
Yeah, there's two features of that. First is this demand for a very perfunctory box checking exercise. But if you engage in that perfunctory box checking exercise, there's actually a perverse effort underway to discourage that really very low barrier to entry Instagram activism. Because once you do that, once you post your black box, the other black box posters now identify you as a soft target. Part of this book identifies, and my last book, Unjust Social Justice and the Unmaking of America, identifies a trait on the part of this very aggressive social justice advocate who believes in this totalitarian vision of how all of society's engines must be harnessed in the same direction, that they're much more likely to go after for apostasy or heresy the people who are inclined to agree with them, in part because that's how you demonstrate efficacy. It does you no good to train your fire on a hard target for 3 days. Nothing happens, and you have to slink away to your next target. So part of the reason why you have this effort underway to attack creatives and creators in creative industries is because mostly they're progressive. They genuinely believe in the core values of the progressive mission. Insofar as I identify them, they are the three legs of the progressive stool are environmental conservation, racial rapprochement, and reducing the disparities of wealth and income. And they're aligned with those in the abstract, and those in theory. But the practice of them, as regards to how the forces of history have come together to culminate in the world historic importance of your burrito, that's the sort of thing where they get off the bus. And they can't get off the bus because to dissent from the program in any one way, shape, or form is to dissent from many other of its tenets yet untold, and to force its members to engage in introspection in ways that they're positively allergic to. So yes, there is no escape from it, particularly if you're inclined towards progressive politics as a disposition, not necessarily in programmatically, but you're disposed towards this generous view of society that progressives and technocrats generally tend to hold. So yeah, that's certainly a feature of the movement.
What do you make then of corporate America? Would you put them in the category of being inclined towards these kind of politics, and as such it makes them a target? Or is it just more of a wishy-washiness? And I see a lot of, from my view, I see a lot of corporate America kind of adrift and unsure which way the winds are blowing, and it makes them a little bit more cowed by the demands for this. I used to do crisis communications before I worked here at the Acton Institute, and when these companies would get involved in some kind of an online-oriented, the mob starts coming after them, and the question is, well, what do we do immediately, right? And my answer was always, for 24 hours, nothing. Because in most cases, 24 to 48 hours, they will have moved on, like you described. They don't get the reaction that they want, and then they move on to the next possible target. So do you think it is an inclination amongst the people who populate C-suites and boardrooms in corporate America to be inclined towards these politics and this philosophy, or is it something else?
It's both. I agree with you. I think they're kind of buffeted by events, which is, if I was an investor, I had your fiduciary responsibility was to me, I would be very discouraged by that sort of leadership. But there's indications that there's financial benefit to cowing to this particular movement. There's such a thing as moral merch, which in the last several years, prior to the pandemic even, but certainly in the increasing in the interim, has been this idea that you should wear your politics on your sleeve. used to be a euphemism for trite and shallow politics. It's now how you're expected to navigate society. You might not know that Levi's jeans are the official jeans of the gun control movement. If you want gun control pants, Levi's your brand. Nike shoes, for example, which is the official shoe of anti-wokeness, or rather anti-racism. All this sort of stuff, it generates returns on investment. These companies that engage in this sort of very low barrier to entry activism do see returns on their investment in this. And it's a modest investment to make in just presenting yourself as having political values. And polls suggest that the public does respond to the idea that they will, the companies that cater to their political values so that they can wear their politics on their sleeve. There's a flip side to that coin that I think we're just only beginning to see emerge now, which is when the product itself becomes adulterated by this need to cater to one particularly uncompromising political vision for all of society. When you have, for example, entertainment companies like Disney that pledge to introduce plotting didactic narratives into their films that don't advance the plot, even risk breaking your suspension of disbelief, rendering the product itself worse in the promotion of these particular values, you have people who now reject it, and it's beginning to show in the bottom line. Likewise, the NFL, which saw its ratings decrease in 2020 and 2021 significantly, as it was promoting racial narratives, going out there and having two national anthems, for example, to which fans routinely and vocally objected, and they were admonished by their betters in the field of sports broadcasting for clinging to their need for an escapism rather than their moral duty to dwell on the horrors of existence at all times and in all things. And you're also starting to see some major companies that would otherwise cow to the backlashes against people who transgress the narrative preferred by the puritanically inclined progressive, like Netflix, like Spotify, which are consumed by the sort of outrage, 72-hour outrage machine that we've become very familiar with, and just buck the pressure, and then the pressure goes away after 96 hours. So you're beginning to see the backlash materialize in a very sustainable way, I think. But it's nascent. It's very incipient.
I thought your point about the way that entertainment is being changed is a particularly interesting one, because someone involved in my line of work, communications and marketing, I don't know if you remember this. This is probably 12 years ago now. There was this film made called An American Carol, which took the concept of A Christmas Carol and it was actually Chris Farley's brother who starred in it as basically Michael Moore, who is visited by these ghosts of America's past, present, and future, and he comes out to be this patriot instead of what Michael Moore was at that time as a result of it. And it's such, in terms of art, it's just bad. It is hitting you over the head with a sledgehammer with the message. And compare that to, and I'll even use something more neutral here as an example and not something decidedly with a progressive message to it. I always think of the difference, if you know the story of the making of Groundhog Day, that the original script treatment for Groundhog Day was much more philosophical. It was much more serious than the comedy that is produced. And Harold Ramis's direction was, it has to be funny first. It has to be funny first. And you will only need to go about an inch below the surface to start getting into some of the interesting moral and philosophical questions that are raised by that film. But its first purpose was to be entertaining. I think you can think of a whole lot of movies that have been made, again, by Hollywood and people primarily on the left that communicate left-wing ideas, but do so in a way that entertains you and brings you along rather than becoming so didactic and beating you over the head with a message.
Yeah, that reminds me of the American Carol. Reminded me of this very spectacularly failed venture. I think it was on Fox News to create a right-wing answer to The Daily Show in the mid-aughts.
The half-hour news hour.
Our news hour. And that was just atrocious. And why was it atrocious? Because it wanted to communicate a political message first. Like you say, it had a moral to it, and you had to be bludgeoned with it because they didn't trust you to accept the subtlety of a theme that isn't necessarily an overarching element of the plot line, but political themes that you, as a human being who's capable of understanding subtlety and nuance, can discern on your own. That kind of condescension, fear of audiences has migrated from the right to the left. The left now berates you with really, as you said, didactic themes, really plotting narratives that are designed to communicate a political value first. The entertainment is secondary. You need to have your hand held and to get to the point that they're trying to make, because they don't trust you to get it on your own. That's very puritanical. The Puritans, big P Puritans themselves, despised art for its own sake. Beauty for its own sake was a form of idleness, and that which is idle is the gravest of sins, because if it's not actively contributing to the promotion of a better society, it's detracting from it as a vessel for evil that will be filled by the devil.
Idle hands are the devil's workshop, right? Yeah.
Correct. So the forms of art that got a pass, portraiture, furniture design, headstone making, got the license that it got because these were records for posterity. They were designed to communicate to future generations what happened here, who these people were. It served a purpose higher than pure art for art's sake. And we see now in the left, which is still occupies the commanding heights of American culture, promoting products that have a mission first, and comedians that emphasize the pain that you had to endure so that you could enjoy something as trite as a punchline. These sort of things detract from the entertainment value, but they have a higher purpose. They fulfill a social purpose, and that's what's really important, not your need for diversion, not your entertainment. Surely that's small and kind of shameful when compared to the great work of our time, the promoting of the Progressive Project.
Dilate a little bit on comedy, because comedy is one of the more interesting areas to me right now, because you see these people like Chappelle. And I go back to one of the funnier things that, again, to pick up a cultural icon here, Saturday Night Live did in the last couple of years, was that sketch of Republican or Not, where based on the statements, the contestants have to guess if the person's a Republican, and the person says, Dave Chappelle is my favorite comedian, starting when? And you have these break points where Chappelle did incredibly amazing, entertaining, and transgressive stuff in Chappelle's Show, and now becomes this figure that is just, to me, oddly associated with the political right. And you have that in juxtaposition to who I know you were referencing earlier on there, the Australian comedian Hannah Gadsby, whose big special, the whole point of which is it's anti-comedy, but not anti-comedy in the way that Steve Martin used to do anti-comedy. It is painful for the purpose of being painful.
Yeah, anti-comedy isn't new. The shtick that is designed to shock, offend, or just confuse isn't new. Hannah's act is a little new insofar as she's funny when she wants to be funny. She doesn't always want to be funny. Sometimes she very explicitly isn't funny. She will set up a punchline and then not allow you the release of the punchline. She'll set up the joke and just let you simmer in the tension. She will circle back to something she said 5 minutes ago and ask you why you thought that was funny. Was my pain really that funny? And why do you think that's funny? And her fans do her a disservice because that's what they love. They really love the attack, the interrogation, to use their words, of this form of humor, insofar as you can call it humor. Because they don't like the joke. They like the pain. They like the lesson that you're supposed to learn from the pain. Couple that with, as I said, this kind of condescension and fear of audiences. And I talk about this in the book. One particular essay that I used to exemplify this point is written by a guy named Seth Simons in 2021 in the New Republic, where he identifies the genesis of the alt-right, sort of racially hostile, anti-democratic vision of American society that's now finds its home on the right, in a form of comedy that was popular in the early 2000s called cringe, which I kind of orbited around at the time. And that version of comedy leveraged unspeakable things for humor values: sexism, racism, homophobia, violence, bigotry, the sort of stuff that you would say, well, if you like that sort of thing, you're probably a bad person, much less if you were to tell that joke. But this is a clinical description of dark humor. To say you're going, to try to anathematize dark humor is to go to war with human nature. This is a salve that allows you to endure life's harshest moments, literally to laugh your way up the gallows steps. This is the essence of dark humor. So Simons draws a straight line from the early 2000s to the sacking of the Capitol on January 6th. This black swan event somehow has been rendered inevitable by this very mundane form of human experience. So that's itself a logical leap. But the condescension is in the fact that neither Simons nor anybody else who criticizes this form of humor believe that the stand-ups on stage talking about this sort of thing are going to act out their antisocial behaviors once they get off stage. They're going to go down into the subway platform and push somebody in front of a train. They don't actually think that's going to happen. You might. They don't know about you. You might be the problem here. You, sap that you are so impressionable that even experiencing, coming into contact with subversive forms of art could trigger in you the latent violent impulses we know you harbor, you bigot. That's the sort of element that is animating this puritanical tendency on the left. And if you couple that with a just sort of suspicion of carefree joy and frivolity, it mirrors Puritanism in ways that are too hard to ignore.
In your opinion, is this an outgrowth of what I see in the evolution of comedy and the influence of modern politics in there? Is you used to have people like George Carlin who were doing social commentary and were doing it in a way that even when I didn't agree with him, I still laughed at it. And you compare that to what you're getting on, say, the late night shows now, and somebody like Stephen Colbert, who is capable of being funny, but is not really saying things that are actually jokes. He's just saying things that a left-wing audience wants to hear in order to draw applause.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the reward structure is in front of that audience for sure. So that the tendency that manifested in Lenny Bruce's persecution, in George Carlin's persecution, in Richard Pryor's eponymous NBC show, which aired for only 4 episodes, was bowdlerized and chopped up and abused to the point where nobody actually wanted to be involved with it, including Pryor and certainly NBC, was a feature of the right. It was the right that saw in these rather innocent aspects of innocent cultural offerings of cultural fare, the capacity to corrupt you and degrade society around you. And why? Because they were flippant about the great challenges of our time. Bruce in particular, but certainly Carlin, and even Pryor, who approached racial issues with a kind of unseriousness that was just unbecoming of a very staid, straight-laced, institutionalist view of the issue in the 1960s, 1970s. So it is sort of this outlook that, and Yuval picked up on this more so than I did in his review of my book, that the role reversal that has left us with this very disorienting situation is in part a view that the parties take of themselves, and those inclined to gravitate towards these parties, whether they support them outright with their votes or not. Just generally, these two camps and the dispositions that would lead you to go into these two camps has switched over the course of the last 20 years or so. Whereas Republicans, regardless of whether they were in or out of power, genuinely regarded themselves as the guarantors of propriety. They were the guardians and stewards of institutions and our institutional heritage, and they were the gatekeepers to those institutions, again, regardless of electoral politics. And by contrast, progressives and Democrats regarded themselves as the insurgents, banging on the windows and the doors, trying to get in and overturn the tables and break things. They regarded themselves as outsiders, and that has very much flipped on its head. Regardless of where the polls end up for Democrats and progressives, they regard themselves now as the guarantors of institutions, the keepers of those institutions, and of general civic propriety. And Republicans, as you can see on a day-to-day basis, regard themselves now as outsiders that are trying to shake things up because they don't perceive themselves to be on the inside anymore. They think they're on the outside. And that's why, one of the reasons why we've seen this role reversal of cultural conflict in which Republicans are attempting to shape and reshape, rather, staid and established conventions. And Democrats are doing their best to keep them together. It's a profound role reversal.
Well, underlying that phenomenon over the same 20 to 30 year course of time, you have the political happening that the parties have essentially been switching their bases in terms of the demographic makeup of who is the base of each of those parties. So you have the Republican Party going from being primarily made up of suburban, college-educated people who are, if not part of the elite, at least adjacent to the elite or aspiring to the elite, and mostly working class people in the Democratic Party, and you're switching these over time. So this is where I think you get this phenomenon now of, I remember reading about this a couple of years ago, of barstool conservatives, which, takes some parts of, I think, instinctual conservatism and some parts of instinctual libertarianism and marries it with kind of a libertinism, a sexual licentiousness, a kind of, Barstool, I think, being often characterized by the way that its founder would send online mobs after female reporters online for, daring to question the idea that Saturday is for the boys. It kind of becomes very bro-y in that sense, too. So I've been equally fascinated by this change and role reversal that has been going on.
Yeah, and it certainly predates the ascension of Donald Trump to lead the Republican Party and to really dominate the conservative movement insofar as there is a conservative movement. But he definitely helped accelerate that trend, I think. Sort of the conventional culture wars that Republicans were inclined to wage, divorce, gay marriage, even to a lesser degree, abortion, as abortion rates had declined dramatically. And now that everybody's navigating this new legal environment ushered in by Dobbs, there's this burst of moral enthusiasm on both sides. But the issue had settled into the background for quite a while because Donald Trump was such a figure that was not beholden to these very traditional sort of moral majoritarian cultural crusades. It sort of helped finish off what was already a tendency in decline. But, nature abhors a vacuum, and Republicans won, lost, or fled the field when it comes to the culture wars in favor now of sort of what I guess you could kind of describe as very online culture wars. They are sort of becoming much more relevant to our day to day. But the degree to which transgenderism dominates our conversation, disproportionate to the actual number of transgender people, is something that future generations will marvel at. I mean, this is the predominant subject of cultural discourse, and it is, by all accounts, a conversation around a very small group of people that most Americans have no personal contact with, which is very, very different from gay marriage, as the gay marriage debate unfolded in the 1990s and early 2000s. So, yeah, I mean, the abstract nature of that conversation, of that debate, renders it kind of low stakes. I don't know if anybody who actually engages in this sort of cultural combat would acknowledge that or would even entertain that idea. But the stakes associated with their various programs are much more aimed at their opponents, at the political opposition and the reaction that the opposition will engender, than it is to advancing rights and privileges for actual individuals and actual human beings. Those human beings end up becoming secondary to the cultural combat. Cultural combat is what enlivens people. It's what gets them out of bed in the morning. It's certainly what makes political careers. It's not as though, Gavin Newsom is being carried on the shoulders of, a parade of transgender people. That's just not happening. It's that he's winning points in the culture wars. Likewise, similar, the other side of it is Ron DeSantis, both of whom have become cultural touchstones and cultural lightning rods for these particular reasons. But broadly, going back to the initial point, is that as Republicans sort of abandoned their very conventional vision of social propriety, Democrats came in, and progressives who had incubated perhaps in college campuses where this culture of safetyism, as John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff identify in Coddling of the American Mind, migrated off campus and into institutions, and they took this worldview with them, this idea of safety, and the idea that trauma, actual physical trauma, can accompany ideas and thoughts and digressions that might be challenging or provocative. the necessary corollary to that idea is that you must make the world safe for people who are perhaps subject to trauma as a result of these ideas. Therefore, the ideas must be de-emphasized. And that becomes a moral campaign, a moral crusade, because you have an absolute right and obligation to ensure the safety of your neighbors. And thus we have the remoralization of society from the left, the sort of thing Gertrude Himmelfarb identified, but couldn't even possibly imagine the ways in which it would manifest. And so that's what we have today.
On your point about the transgenderism issue, isn't this where social media and the rapidity of information come in? Because while you're right, it unfolds differently than gay marriage because people realized that there were people in their orbits that they knew who were affected by this issue. You're right. Fewer people know somebody who is transgender, but through the phenomenon we have of social media, something that happens 3,000 miles away feels like it is in your backyard, even if you don't actually know the people. And if we go full down the road of Yuval Levin's points about crumbling institutions that bring us together in real senses of intimacy with others, because we have put so much of that online, it feels just as real to us if it's 3,000 miles away and it's somebody that we don't know. But now we know that that person exists. To me, it's the same phenomenon as of what initiated the French-Iranian wars a couple of years ago between David French and Sohrab Ahmari, where Sohrab is so fit to be tied about this event that is happening in Sacramento when he lives in New York and it's thousands of miles away. That's the impetus for it. Whereas in a pre-social media age, if you said to somebody in Peoria, hey, in Sacramento, at a library once a week, a drag queen reads a storybook to kids, the person's reaction would probably be, that's weird. And then they would move on with their day. But because of the greater forum for interaction and seeing what's going on in places that aren't your backyard but feel like it, it feels like the issue is so much closer and bigger than maybe it actually is.
Yeah, and who knows? It might have been a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of Sohrab to devote so much attention to this, because our all-consuming need to provoke and frustrate the other side ensured that this transgender, fad in libraries and what have you had more reach and more.
It's its own Streisand effect, yeah.
Precisely, a Streisand effect, yeah. So it had more appeal than it probably would have organically. But that's not a defense of anybody. That's actually more an indictment, just the shallowness of deriving some measure of satisfaction from annoying the right people is a rather unlovely trait. But yeah, most certainly the way that tribes organize themselves 1,000 miles away from you offends on an instinctual level. And because we have the town square now that resides in your pocket and is with you all times every day, as you are confronted with the disparate, disorienting ways in which other societies organize themselves. It's the miracle of federalism that allows us all to get together and live with each other. But that's actually politics properly understood. And nobody wants to understand politics anymore properly understood. We talk about things that are political. We impose political themes on things that have no business being political because they are resistant to legislative remedy. They have nothing whatsoever to do with electoral outcomes or legislative affairs. They are just sort of vaguely political in a way that you would have to, that used to be a thought experiment relegated to freshman seminars. It is now how we navigate all of existence. We talk about every feature of American society in terms that you used to reserve for the faculty lounge and academic discussions, because they are very much, in the literal sense, academic. But now they have assumed an outsized importance.
As we conclude here, I want to ask you, I think it's the obvious concluding question. So what do we do about this? I wonder if you give it attention this way. So one of the missions of the Acton Institute is to promote a free and virtuous society. So clear the idea that promoting virtue within our culture, within our civil society is an important thing. And I think if you asked a lot of these activists, they would think that they are promoting a sense of what is good. It manifests itself in the more totalitarian ways that I think you've described. But how What do we do about this? And how do we go about it in a way that would be copacetic with promoting a view of a virtuous society that doesn't turn into its own version of this kind of puritanical impulse, but also doesn't become, I think, what we were just talking about there, which is people who are, being a jerk in response to things that annoy them for the purpose of being a jerk. Being provocative can have a point. But we see so much, I think, in our culture wars where people are being provocative for the purpose of trolling people or for drinking liberal tears and these other things that I don't think are a good and constructive impulse and doesn't lead towards the kind of society that I think we would agree that we want, which is ones where people who do have differences of opinion can coexist and get along with each other and try to use politics for what it is supposed to be, which is a way to come to accommodations on big problems where we do have differences.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think you would answer the question probably better than I would. But there's a reason why in the book, the chapters, for example, are organized by unimpeachable values: piety, prudence, order, austerity, temperance, and the fear of God. A lot of the things that, and when you apply a moral framework to what we're seeing manifest on the progressive left these days, a lot of it becomes understandable and defensible. For example, in the chapter on temperance, young progressive activists have rediscovered something that conservatives have known since time immemorial, which is that when you have young men and women in social situations that are bathed in alcohol, socially destabilizing things can happen, and the fabric of social order can come apart. And that's not necessarily a great thing. We should probably preserve the social order. Conservatives would recognize that as an unimpeachable value, albeit one that rejects the philosophy advanced by sexual revolutionaries in the 1960s, 1970s, and the Democrats who took over the political environment in the 1990s and adhered to those particular values. So the moral framework is good. It manifests itself in this very paranoid, totalitarian fashion on the left. The ways to break that down, I think the negative aspects of what is in many ways a defensible moral code is, again, to have the permission to laugh at it, and first and foremost, in part because this very small group of individuals, I'm not talking about progressives, I'm not talking about Democrats, I'm not talking about liberals, it's a very particular sort of progressive that punches far above their weight and captures many institutions just based on the menace that they present. First of all, to give you permission to laugh at them, because the laughing at them is disarming. And the second is, as we talked about earlier, commercial pressures, which I think will have their own effect of breaking this thing apart, as they did in the 19th century. I wrote about in the book the story of Banned in Boston, which is a phrase that described the sort of moral social order and policing of public morality in mainline Protestant New England. That was very effective, much more effective than it was in the rest of the country. These societies for the suppression of vice arose all over the country, but they were most effective in New England at bawdlerizing plays, banning dime store novels, making sure that the cultural fare that the rest of the country had access to, you didn't as a New Englander. But this evolved from a admonishment to avoid titillating literary experiences to a profoundly compelling advertisement for them. Publishers eventually tried to have their books banned in Boston. And we see this in the way in which conservative books, which find themselves banned on Amazon, banned on Facebook, is the modern analogy, modern equivalent, achieve wild commercial success, disproportionate to the PR campaigns around those books. Just about anything that contravenes modern progressive moral sensibilities and certainly generates some controversy around it finds itself having far more commercial appeal than it would have had the aspiring censors in our midst just ignored it. That's the sort of thing that has the capacity to break down these strictures, because you're communicating to firms which have one objective, which is the advancement of their bottom line and the fiduciary responsibilities to their investors. Regardless of their morals will have little to no choice but to provide the kind of entertaining fare, regardless of its moral value, that people actually want to consume. And as we talked about earlier, increasingly, that fare has conventional conservative values associated with it, or at least conventional American values. These ideas of expression for its own sake, the free and unfettered exploration of ideas, tolerance properly understood as toleration, and not just grudging acceptance. These are the sort of things that increasingly accompany the dissent against this modern progressive orthodoxy. And if you have hope for the future, as I do, that's a very hopeful sign.
Noah Rothman is the associate editor of Commentary Magazine and the author of The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun, which we've been discussing today. Noah, thank you so much for joining us today on Act in Line.
Thank you so much for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Act in Line, I'm Eric Cohn.